tell some tall tales about folks in and around Graham. And feel free to ask questions throughout. I'm sure Walter will be okay with throughout. And then please tour the museum whenever we get done. Again, thank you for coming.
Thank you, Brian.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Who are you again? What's your name?
Walter Boyd.
There you go.
And for those of you that don't know me, I'm sure most of you don't. I was born in Burlington. My family's lived in Alamance County since it was first settled around 1749. My family were, on my mother's side, were Quakers that settled in the Cane Creek area. And I grew up in Elon. Went to Elon College. The reason I was there is my great-grandfather came to Elon when it first opened in the 1890s. And I knew most of the people from Elon connected with the college or their children or grandchildren, including the Long family. I knew pretty well. And when I was coming into the museum here, I noticed lots of photos of Dr. Long, his son, Little Will Long, who was a dentist and fire chief here in Graham for many, many years, and Dr. Stokes, who was one of my history professors at Elon. By the way, I'm not a historian. I'm just interested. My college training, I majored in biology and chemistry, and my profession, I was a lawyer for 30-some years in Washington, D.C. And then I came back and I started hearing so many bad historical stories about this area that I said, well, I'm going to try to write some of this stuff down and get it straight. I'm more of a Burlington Elon person, but I do know a little bit about Graham. As I mentioned to Brian a little while ago, my cousin Heenan Hughes was mayor of Graham about 120 years ago. Also, my grandmother worked here in 1915 at the old courthouse under Charles Johnston, Register of Deeds. And at the time, she was engaged to Ira Ward, who was mayor of Graham. And so I have a whole bunch of old Graham photos and things like that. I'll have to make sure that they make their way into the museum here. But I want to tell you, start out today and tell you a story. I first heard the story of Jesse James being in this area from my grandmother many years ago when I was little. And I asked her, by the way, she was born in 1890 and grew up in Elon, lived in Elon her whole life, lived to be into her almost 94 years old. Now, when she was a little girl, my grandmother's best friend was Alma Newman. And Alma was the daughter of Professor J.U. Newman and his wife, the former Patty Long. Patty Long had been born here in Graham in 1864. Her father, John Henry Long, had moved from Graham to western Missouri, northwestern Missouri, about 1857. And there he married Julia Clapp, who was also from this area. Her family was from this area. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, John Henry and his wife came back to Graham so he could enlist in the Confederate Army. And he stayed here until 1867, his daughter Patty being born while she was there. Well, when my grandmother was little, she was over at Patty Long Newman's house all the time. All of Patty's children, except her youngest, were born and with the inability to hear. And Patty Long didn't want them to be treated any differently from anybody else, so she taught them all to read lips. I don't know whether you know her children, some of her children or of them, but Dr. Joe Newman in Burlington was our family dentist for many years, and he was one of her sons. And Lila Newman, who was an art teacher at Elon for 50 years. They could not hear, but they certainly didn't indicate that they could. Patty taught them to read lips. Matter of fact, Patty's was written up in Cornet magazine in 1946. It's her remarkable life. She was an amazing woman. She was kind of like my grandmother's second mother. And back about 1895, grandmother said, you know, Ms. Newman mentioned to me one day that when she was a little girl, she rode in Jesse James's lap on a wagon. And I said, well, that's kind of peculiar. And I didn't think much about it. I said, well, was it out in Missouri or here? And she said, I don't really remember. But she said, I remember her mentioning Jesse James. And I remember her, she said, I remember her talking about how her father and Jesse James were good friends, and her Uncle Jake and Jesse James were good friends. But she did mention too, she said that, and Jesse James lived in this area for a while. Well, being a small child, I just took it in one ear and out the other. But as I got older, I started asking around, and I started hearing stories from people, and they said, you know, I heard that from my grandmother too, or great grandmother, or something like that. Said they talked about Jesse James and his brother Frank being here in this area. So, and then another thing she told my grandmother, she said that Patty said my Uncle Jake knew Jesse James very well. And Jake Long, if you don't know who he was the younger brother of Patty's father, John Henry Long, also the younger brother of Reverend W.S. Long, who founded Graham College and Elon College. And when my grandmother was growing up, Jake Long lived next door to her in Elon. His daughters were going to college there. And so he built a house, which is still standing there at the corner of Atkinson Avenue and West Trollinger and East Trollinger Avenue. And that was the old Jake Long house, even though it's called the Atkinson house today. My grandmother lived in the old Williamson house, which was across Atkinson Avenue on the next corner. So they were very close. Now, over the years that I've investigated local history, I've come across more and more stories about Jesse James being in this area, and it's around 1870. Now, unfortunately, nearly all of these accounts can be labeled nothing more than family tradition. And there's always a question about, okay, what's real and what's not. But while there's no documentation, all of these stories seem to have similar things in common. And I've sat down and said, okay, here's what they all said, here's what we can discount, and here's what we have to take into account. And it's amazing how similar these stories are without these people having any real connection. I mean, my dad used to work up in the Williamsburg area for Burlington Industries. You know, it's a little corner of Alamance County up there near Matkins. The Williamsburg community is more in Rockingham County, but it's just across the Alamance County line. And all of these people up there seem to have some story. And all these stories have, you know, interesting things in common. Well, at this juncture, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Jesse James, I mean, if you watched a bunch of Westerns growing up, you probably know. A lot of young people never heard of him. Jesse was born in Clay County, Missouri, which is in the upper northwestern part of Missouri, on September 5th, 1847. He was the second son of a Baptist minister named Reverend Robert James, and his mother's name was Zerelda Cole. Jesse's father died in California, in the California goldfields in 1850, when Jesse was only 2.5 years old. So he really didn't know his father at all. At Clay County, Missouri, Most of the people who lived in that area had come from either Kentucky, Tennessee, or North Carolina, and they were very loyal to their home states. Although Missouri, when the Civil War broke out, although Missouri remained in the Union, the people in Clay County were overwhelmingly pro-Confederate. Jesse's older brother, he had a brother 2 years older than him, Alexander Franklin James, who they called Frank. And Frank had joined a group of Confederate guerrillas led by William Quantrill. Now, Jesse wasn't old enough to join the guerrillas until 1864, and he signed up with William T. Anderson, who was called Bloody Bill. Anderson, like Quantrill, engaged in unconventional and brutal warfare with the Union Army troops and civilian Union sympathizers. One such raid that Jesse is known to have participated in was called the Centralia Raid. Took place on September 27th, 1864. Anderson's guerrillas stopped a train carrying about 22 Union soldiers who were coming back from the front and returning to their homes. They were all unarmed. Anderson's men attacked them and killed most of them. A large party of 142 Union soldiers then set out in pursuit of Anderson and his men, and Anderson ambushed them and killed nearly all of them, 123 of them, I believe. Now, it was during this battle that Jesse James was severely wounded. He was tended for quite a few months by his cousin, Zerelda Mims, who was called Z, and Z eventually married Jesse in 1874. Although the war ended in April of 1865 with the surrender of the Confederate Army of Tennessee, which incidentally was camped in what's now downtown Burlington, Jesse and his brother Frank never really surrendered. They kept on fighting the Union and Union ideals for the rest of their lives. Although they kind of gave up on guerrilla warfare and mainly engaged in robbing banks. And now, Jesse and Frank got the reputation many years later as being sort of Robin Hood characters. They only robbed from the evil Union banks and gave to the poor Confederates. But that wasn't true. They were nowhere near being Robin Hood type characters. They stole actually from their friends, mostly in Missouri. Now, some of their more notable robberies took place later in 1867, but there was one on March 20th, 1868 in Russellville, Kentucky. After the Russellville raid, Jesse and Frank dropped out of sight for more than a year, and nobody knows where they went, except family and friends, and nobody said a word. Now, if you read any history of Jesse James, they talk about the Russellville raid and Jesse and Frank disappeared. And the question is, where do they go? Now, it's known that for a while, the James brothers, after their robberies, would go out and hide in Kentucky and Tennessee. But the Russellville raid was so big, I think they needed to get a little bit farther away than Kentucky and Tennessee. So the question is, where do they go? And the answer is, I think they were here. Now, at first blush, it might seem strange that there be any connection at all between the James brothers and Graham. But indeed there was. The connections between the people of Clay County, Missouri, And this area are just too numerous to mention in their entirety, so I'll just talk about a few of them. For example, practically everybody here knows a member of the Albright family, or maybe an Albright. One of the closest friends that Jesse and Frank James had in Clay County growing up was Joel Thomas Albright, and his family was from here. Joel himself was born in Clay County in 1843, but his parents were Daniel and Amelia Holt Albright, and they were members of Providence Church up here. In fact, so many of Amelia Holt Albright's old relatives from this area came that they founded a town in Clay County called Holt, and it was very close to the James farm. So we have the James brothers knowing lots of Holts and lots of Albrights who had relatives in this area who were even born in this area. Another close friend of the James brothers was James Robert Cummings, who's nicknamed Jim. Jim was born in Clay County the same year as Jesse, 1847. Now, his parents were from Guilford County, but just right across the Guilford County line from Altamahaw and Ossipee. And Jim Cummings attended school with Jesse, fought in the Civil War as a member of Bloody Bill Anderson's group, and joined the James Gang after the war. Another person who was well known to the James brothers was John Dixon Holt. And he was born in Alamance County in 1827 and moved to Clay County about 1845. He fought in the Mexican War and rose to the rank of colonel in the regular Confederate Army. He also allied himself with Quantrill, and after the war, returned to Clay County and became a merchant. And he often distributed, as a merchant in Clay County, he distributed goods made by his cousin, Edwin Michael Holt, E.M. Holt, who was making textiles here. So that was kind of a line of communication between Alamance County and Clay County, Missouri. Incidentally, John Dixon's Holt was his uncle by marriage was Dr. William Tarpley of Burlington. Dr. Tarpley's family had inherited through marriages mostly just about all of the land that is now Burlington. It was originally Cook land, and Cook married into the Tarpley family. And Dr. Tarpley was one of the largest landowners in the area. Another person, James S. Holt, was born in March 1848. He was born in the northwest part of Alamance County. And he came to Clay County, Missouri with his parents in 1851, and he went to school with Jesse James and Jim Cummings. Now, I've already mentioned John Henry Long, Patty Long Newman's father. When he married Julia Clapp, she turned out to be John Dixon Holt's first cousin, and the marriage was performed by Joel Albright's brother, who was Jesse James's first cousin by marriage. So there was all this interconnection between the families here. Now, the Civil War, as everyone knows, kind of thoroughly devastated the South and North Carolina and this area in particular. In Alamance County, soldiers found their farms in ruins, their livestock eaten or carried off by looters, and had no money to buy materials and seed to repair and restore their farms. With no way to really earn a living, they turned to theft to survive, so crime skyrocketed here. And another part of that is that the newly freed slaves also received nothing, and they had no idea how to get a job or to get land or anything else. So they also turned to theft, just like the former Confederate soldiers did. In an attempt to combat the crime, and also in a large part to preserve white supremacy, most of the South turned to secret organizations that are generically referred to as the Ku Klux Klan, although each area had its own name for its local Klan-like organizations. Here in Alamance County, it was called the White Brotherhood, and it was founded in August 1868, actually just on the other side of the courthouse here on East Elm Street in the old brick hotel in the office of Jacob Alson Long, who was John Henry Long's younger brother. Jake Long had gone to Staunton Military Academy in Virginia and served during the last year of the war in a Virginia artillery battery. After the war, he came here to Graham and opened his law office in the old brick hotel. That part of the hotel that he would have occupied would have been what's now Graham Soda Shop up on the Jake's law office, according to people that knew it, was up on the second floor of the old brick hotel. That portion of the old brick hotel was all torn down in 1903 and rebuilt as the Vessel Hotel, which is the building that's there now. Now, the year 1867 found the James brothers living in Nashville, Tennessee. Now, no one is quite sure whether they were hiding out there at the time or if Jesse had gone there for better medical treatment. He had been wounded in the fall of 1864, and even though he was nursed back to health by his cousin, he wasn't in very good health for the next year or two because of that. Now, at the time the James brothers were there, Nashville was the center of a vicious confrontation between the Klan and a group called the Union League. Now, at the end of the Civil War, most of the Democrats, being Confederate soldiers and white men, were disenfranchised. And the Republicans, especially around 1867, realized that nobody was going to vote for the Republican Party once the states were readmitted back into the Union. So they attempted power play, try to get a good political base in the southern states. North Carolina's governor at the time was William W. Holden, the Republican, and he set up Union League offices all over the different counties in North Carolina. And most of the Union League members were former slaves. And Holden gave the Union League organizations money, favors, all sorts of things to get them to get out and get their fellow freemen to join the Republican Party and always vote Republican. And that way the Republicans figured they could hold on to power. Now, out there, they were doing the same thing out in Nashville, Tennessee at the time. And to put down the Klan out there at Nashville, the local officials hired a fellow named George Washington Kirk to put down any confrontations with the Klan and destroy Klan power. During the Civil War, George Washington Kirk was born in Greenville, Tennessee, right there on the border between Virginia and between North Carolina and Tennessee. During the Civil War, he was a staunch Unionist and prevailed upon the Union Army to make him commander of a guerrilla outfit, which he did. And Kirk and his several hundred to several thousand men went all over eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina, attacking any pro-Confederates that they could find, whether it be Confederate Army, supplies, whatever. But it was just like what William Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson were doing to Unionists out there in Missouri. It was just brutal, partisan type warfare. And so the James brothers were very aware of George Washington Kirk and what he's doing there. Now, Jake Long's White Brotherhood here in Alamance County was actually comprised of several camps. These were like smaller organizations, usually geographically designated. There were approximately a dozen of them. And interestingly, most of them were under the command of men with Clay County, Missouri connections. Among these were John G. Albright. He was chief of Camp 2 here. His cousin was Joel T. Albright, one of the James brothers' friends. Albert Murray, who was another camp chief, he was Alamance County Sheriff. And he was first cousin by marriage to Thomas Coleman Younger, who was the uncle of James gang member Cole Younger. John T. Trollinger of Company Shops, who was chief of Camp 4, his cousin was Jim Cummings, who was a James gang member and a very close friend. William Stalker, Joe Fawcett, David Mebane, George Anthony, Jasper Wood, and William Tickle were all high-ranking White Brotherhood members here, and all had relatives in Clay County, Missouri. Now, following their bank robbery in Russellville in March of 1868, Jesse and Frank were reported by friends and relatives to be staying at the home of Nellie Pritchett Vincent in Thompsonville, which is in Rockingham County. Nellie was the aunt of their childhood friend, James S. Holt. Now, the Williamsburg community, as I mentioned, have many oral traditions of the James brothers being there in 1868. All of them agree on several points. That the James brothers always went to church. I don't know whether that's true or whether everybody just said that to make everybody think they were good people. Everybody's pretty much in agreement they stayed with Mrs. Vincent, or at least on her property. They were interested in horses and horse races, and they frequently made trips to Locust Hill, which was just across the border in Caswell County. And other things that were mentioned were that the James brothers, when they arrived in 1868, came with several others, but no identification of these others has ever been made. Now, at the time they arrived in 1868, the James brothers, despite their bank robberies, were not well known. In other words, their bank robberies were reported locally in Missouri and Tennessee and Kentucky, but they didn't make national news. And in fact, it wasn't until after a robbery in 1869 that the James brothers were publicly declared outlaws and would have been known and recognized, and would have had to have been more careful. Now, the Williamsburg community was known as a hotbed of Klan activity at the time, particularly in the fall of 1868. While there's no evidence that Jesse and Frank were members of the Klan, it would seem very likely that they were. All of their friends in Clay County, Missouri seem to have been. And I think that would have been true of all their friends and family members here in Alamance County. One incident in particular concerned a former slave of E.M. Holt's named Caswell Holt. Now, Caswell Holt, in the fall of 1868, was reported to be stirring up blacks against whites. It was all sorts of things were reported about him. He was a chicken thief. He stole grain. Who knows what's true and what's not. But in any event, an order went out from George Anthony's camp to do something about Caswell Holt, to whip him into keeping his mouth shut was the general activity that the White Brotherhood did in the fall of 1868. And John Trollinger's camp was ordered to carry out the whipping. It occurred late Friday night in the fall of 1868. Now, remember that both George Anthony, who ran Alamance Lumber Company, by the way, down on Webb Avenue here, and John Trollinger had strong Clay County connections. Now, the oddest thing, when Caswell Holt, at the time he was living on Colonel Jerry Holt's property. Jerry Holt was a cousin of E.M. Holt. And Jerry owned quite a bit of land between company shops and Graham along Webb Avenue. As a matter of fact, he was George Anthony's son-in-law, his father-in-law. But that's where Caswell was living at the time, and he went and told Jerry, Colonel Jerry, he said, you know, I've just got beat by the Klan. He said, I want to do something about it. Now, when he told Colonel Jerry Holt this, Jerry Holt told him, he said, well, it wouldn't be of any use to you because the people that beat you weren't local. He said, they came from 1,000 miles away. Now, I've always thought that was an unusual statement. All the things that Jerry Holt said, why did he say 1,000 miles away? Could have said 100 miles away, or they just could have been from somewhere else, but he said 1,000 miles. It's interesting that Clay County, Missouri is 1,000 miles from Alamance County. I always thought that was just a strange and odd thing to say. Now, after Caswell Holt's beating, things spun rapidly out of control, and during 1869 and 70, there were numerous whippings, beatings, and threats against an estimated 100 people, about 65% white, 35% black. But no known deaths occurred until that White Outlaw, biracial Union League official and Graham Town commissioner, who was lynched at Courthouse Square in February 26, 1870. And that was shortly followed by the murder of William Puryear, who claimed to have recognized those who murdered Wyatt. Now, it's not known how long Jesse and Frank James were in North Carolina the first time they came, but apparently they were back in Missouri by the summer of 1869 while all this activity was taking place in and around Graham. They were both implicated in the holdup of a bank in Gallatin, Missouri on December 7, 1869. And Jesse shot and killed the cashier, Captain John Sheets. The two were then publicly proclaimed outlaws and became national news. A short time later, they disappeared again, and that's when they were alleged to have come back to North Carolina. Now, it's not known if Jesse and Frank had made it back here, this area, on the night White Outlaw was lynched, but it's certainly possible. An interesting notice appeared in the Greensboro Patriot newspaper on June 2nd, 1870, thanking our friends from Missouri for bringing by copies of recent newspapers from that state. And it would be interesting to know if they were referring to Frank and Jesse James or any member of their gangs. Now, Governor Holden was incensed by the murder of his friend White Outlaw and decided to take action following the murder of State Senator John Stevens up at the courthouse in Yanceyville on May the 21st, 1870. Holden declared Alamance County to be in a state of, and Caswell County to be in a state of insurrection, and called for troops to put down the rebellion that summer. To command the troops, he called on George Washington Kirk, who was the same one who tried to put down Klan activities in Nashville, Tennessee. Kirk and his men, who were really nothing more than armed criminals, swooped into Graham and company shops and arrested all those they believed part of the plan. Assuming that Frank and Jesse James did return to North Carolina, it's doubtful if they stayed on during the Kirk-Holden War, especially after seeing what Kirk had done out in Nashville. And since they were already wanted outlaws, they didn't want to attract too much attention. Now, one person, however, that George Washington Kirk wanted to arrest was Jake Long, since he was head of the Klan, or the White Brotherhood, here in Alamance County. But he was tipped off about his arrest and left. Now, he escaped to his brother's home, his brother John's home, which at that time was in Lafayette County, Missouri, right beneath Clay County. Patty Long Newman later said that her Uncle Jake, she recalled him visiting the family for several months during the summer of 1870. And during that time, she also heard that her Uncle Jake knew Jesse James, and the two of them were good friends. And it was about this time that Patty mentioned riding in the wagon in Jesse James's lap. And she would have been about 5.5 years old. So that makes a lot of sense. Now, as I mentioned, that Jake Long, he actually returned back here to Graham after the Kirk-Holden War ended. Governor Holden was thrown out of office, and Colonel Kirk was actually discredited. And one of the interesting things is, as I mentioned, when Elon College was founded and opened in 1890, Jake Long built a house in Elon. He lived next to my grandmother, and grandmother did mention what she remembered about Jake Long. She said she and all the other kids were scared to death of him, and they figured if he got mad at them, that Jake Long would take him out in the woods and hang him like he did that poor black man years ago. So I always thought that was an interesting story. Actually, when I heard that story when I was little, it kind of scared me. I thought Jake Long would come back and try to do the same thing to me. But Jake died in 1923. He was actually clerk of court here in Graham for many years, and his son Elmer actually became lieutenant governor. Very interesting fellow. Another person that ran to Clay County, Missouri and hid for 6 months was George Anthony of Company Shops. And it's known that Frank and Jesse were in North Carolina after 1870, but it doesn't appear that they ever came back to Alamance County, and I don't know the reason. It is known that Jesse was in Yanceyville in 1876, shortly after his failed robbery with the younger brothers in Northfield, Minnesota. Most of the younger brothers were killed, and Jesse and Frank then went hid out again. It said that Jesse wound up in Caswell County. Now, it was while he was in Yanceyville that Jake Long reported that he met Jesse there. And they actually met in the same room that Senator John Stevens was murdered in. I always thought that was an interesting thing, but that's the one story about Jesse James that Jake Long always told, meeting him at the Caswell County Courthouse in 1876. Now, Frank James was really fond of this area. And after Jesse's death, Frank was tried for his crimes, and in all the testimony, he was free and easygoing about talking about what he and Jesse had done. And he's the one that mentioned we spent a lot of time in North Carolina. He didn't mention any specific individuals that they hung out with. But in 1881, Frank and his wife and son stayed at the McAdoo house on South Elm Street in Greensboro. They were very fond of it. And Frank mentioned that in his trial. And he said, you know, we were going to live there. I'm not sure whether he was talking about we being his wife and son or him and his brother Jesse. But he said, while we were there in 1881, he said there was an outbreak of diphtheria. And he said that scared us so badly, we went on back to Missouri. And I do know that there was an outbreak of diphtheria in October 1881 because my great-grandfather lost a brother and a sister in that diphtheria outbreak at the same time. But Frank said he definitely would have settled in Greensboro. And he was also even looking for work in Winston-Salem. He was using an alias, though. His alias at the time was J. Ed Warren. Now, as everyone knows, Jesse James was murdered by a member of his gang at his home on April the 3rd, 1882. Interestingly, in an article in the Kansas City, Missouri Daily News, the day after, there was a mention that Jesse lived for a time in North Carolina, and that while he was here, his alias was J.T. Jackson. So I kind of shortened it up a little bit for time constraints, but that's generally what I can tell you. There's no firm documentary evidence other than perhaps Frank James's own statements at his trial that they were here. But to figure out exactly what they did, you're not going to find anything, any type of documentary evidence, unless, of course, maybe somebody kept a diary, but I doubt that. But that's about all we have on what they were doing, and perhaps one day somebody will be able to figure out more. But while there's no definite proof that the James brothers were here in this area, there's certainly nothing to discount it. And these absences from Missouri indicate they were somewhere, and I think there's a pretty good chance it was actually here. I think somebody's coming in, but anyway, that's all I have. If you have any specific questions you'd like to ask, I'll be happy to try to answer.
Thank you, Walter, for coming out this afternoon. Again, guys, feel free to hang out in the museum. You're a little nervous about asking questions in front of the group. Walter hopefully will be here for a few minutes. So grab him and bend his ear for a little bit longer.
Yeah, I'd be happy. Yeah.
And once again, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.